Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Monday, April 14th, 2025. This is episode 361, and we're going to talk about Triffin's dilemma again, in contrast and comparison with Ron Paul. So, back in a couple episodes ago, in episode 353, I talked about Triffin's dilemma, which was actually, at least by my channel's standards, uh, kind of listened to a little bit more than others. And I had I watched the episode from Monaco 64, and he basically explained Triffin's dilemma this way, that basically people have to earn dollars by selling goods to America. And this is primarily because of the reserve currency status of the United States. Other countries need to earn dollars. So Triffin apparently noted that a country whose currency is the global reserve currency held by other nations as foreign exchange reserves to support international trade must somehow supply the world with its currency in order to fulfill the world demand for these FX reserves, foreign exchange reserves. This supply function is nominally accomplished by international trade, with the country holding reserve currency status being required to run an inevitable trade deficit. So basically, Monaco talked about it in the sense of how Trump was disrupting the system that everyone had grown accustomed to by drastically, uh, making all of these, and instituting all these tariffs, thereby denying people access to the dollar. So after that, I think it was on Friday, MisesMedia with Dr. Bob Murphy uploaded a video called Trump's Tariffs. Triffin is wrong. Ron Paul is right. And I listened to it several times. The first couple times was I was doing other things, like cleaning. But, I listened to it carefully again several times just so I could get it right. And so basically, the argument, and in case you don't listen to it, it's an hour long, and I will summarize it for you the best that a humanities professor can. So basically, until the 1970s, once the reserve currency status was established, the United States basically had either a surplus trade or pretty much balanced trade, right? So this flies in the face of the claim that there must be a trade deficit. But it's with the ending of the gold backing of the dollar, and it goes that we begin to see trade deficits, right? That you see chronic trade deficit, right? And so the trade deficit just keeps increasing as we, get closer to today. Uh, so the deficit is the focus, right? And so you still see dollars for goods, but it's not necessarily a deficit, right? And so what he's basically saying is the U.S. had the reserve currency, after the Bretton Woods agreement. So which was fine until the early 1970s. So the United States either had balanced trade or a small surplus in trade. And it's when uh, Nixon ended the gold standard, that's when everything starts going sideways, right? And so Dr. Murphy goes into also the effect of coming off the gold standard, what it had to quality of life, standard of living here, worker compensation here in the United States, right? So Ron Paul believes that it's all because of the Fed. In fact, when Nixon went off the gold standard, that's what got him into politics. And so once that, uh, you know, unhindered money printing began, you began to see this chronic trade deficit, whatever that deficit is. And so he goes into this whole explanation as to how trade deficits, there are different kinds of trade deficits, right? And so, I got last week, I got the idea of doing a racialization of trade deficit, right? We think of a category, a trade deficit, and we think that they're all the same. But there are different reasons why you would have a trade deficit. And, Dr. Murphy goes into this. In early America, there are no factories here in the colonies, early United States. And so people are pouring in investments here into the United States to build factories, railroads, etc. And so when you see that, you see a deficit. But that's because, people are investing into America. So a trade deficit is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not necessarily a good thing either, right? And so there's a lot of nuance there. There's a lot of variety in this idea of trade deficit in terms of what causes it. And as with most things today, it's a very superficial conversation where either trade deficits are always bad or they are not it's irrelevant, like it's not a big deal. And that's where Triffin's dilemma comes in, right? So the people who say that the trade deficit is not a big deal, they invoke Triffin, where he says, well, if you have the reserve currency, you're always going to have a trade deficit. And so Dr. Murphy is saying, no, there are different kinds of trade deficits. Not all of them are necessarily bad, right? So early America, as I just said, people are, sending lots of goods to the United States in order to build its infrastructure. Right. So trade deficits in and of themselves are not necessarily problematic, but it is coming off the gold standard, which creates a lot of these other problems that people are talking about today, such as worker compensation versus productivity. And so, towards the tail end of that episode, Dr. Murphy goes into the leftist argument, like say, oh, no, it's not the trade deficit that's important that you need to look at. It's worker compensation, right? Wages for workers versus productivity. And there was a graph that was going around that worker productivity, as that was increasing, so did worker compensation. And then all of a sudden, they split, where the productivity continues to go up at the same rate, but worker compensation flatlines, right? Uh, so again, this is because of uh, the dollar leaving the gold standard, right? Because that separation takes place after 1971. More specifically, you begin to see measurable impact after 1973. And what a lot of leftists will eagerly try to do is try to blame it all on Reagan, but he doesn't enter office until 1980. So it's a little awkward. And towards the end, he talks about how a lot of Dr. Murphy talks about how a lot of graphs start at 1979. And that's the classic leftist creation of a narrative by arbitrarily picking a starting point, which makes your argument look so much better. Um, so basically, it's my sort of revisiting of a topic that apparently has a lot more nuance than what might at first appear. And maybe I'm not having debates with Triffin's dilemma, but listening to the podcast, apparently a lot of people are. And so having that clarification, I think, was important to make. But then it also raises another issue that I had been encountering, a lot in the church context. And that is, I've met a lot of people who, and briefly, oh, so briefly, but the impression I got was that a lot of people, Christians in this situation, they need to have a neat, compact, tidy truth, right? They want to know, they have this, it seems to me, this is the only way I can describe it, that they have this image of what the truth is, and it's like a sentence or it's an idea, right? And once you learn it, once you learn this little factoid, you have the truth, and you can kind of go from there, right? And when you see something like Triffin's dilemma or the tariffs, again, it's the same phenomena, right? No, this is the truth. You have to listen to me. You're wrong because what you're saying is not my truth. It's not the truth that I was taught to believe. And so Bob Murphy talks about the creation of the narrative to pin responsibility on Reagan. So you had to create this idea that deficits are not really that bad because you want to pin other issues and blame Reagan for it, right? And so why is it that so many people are doing this? Why is it, and I've talked about this before, but sort of in passing, that why do people sort of have this need to have this simple truth? Like there's a thread that I also participate in on X, and I've noticed that several people kind of want to believe that their way of knowing, their epistemology, somehow will lead them to the truth. And it's very interesting, it's interesting to a point. Like I'll read it and say basically, well, that's one way of doing it. It's subjective, but to claim that it is the end all be all of trying to understand what is true, well, maybe, but I doubt it. And you can tell right away because of the assumptions that are made. Like if you are going to make certain assumptions, what you are basically declaring is a subjective perspective, right? So if you're, in other words, if you start with different assumptions, then your subjectivity is going to be different. So depending on your subjectivity, what is going to be true to you? Well, sure. Uh, and the important thing for me is that you remain open because anytime, at any given time, any of us will sort of drift into this mentality where we need something to be true. We want something to be true, and we want to believe that is always and ever true, right? And so I never have to worry about it. And sometimes that kind of idea is easy to hold. Like, you're my child. You will always be my child. Okay, so that would be something easy. But when it comes to something like God or economic theory, right, which is a lot less smaller than God, but you get the idea. Something that's a little bit more complex, it's not such an easy thing to say that there's so many nuances. Plus, on top of everything else, there's human action. So, given that the trend has always been that people go left, you're always going to have someone who decides that today is the day that they are going to go right, defy all of the trends and do something totally different and new, and it works, right? And so now you're going to change the paradigm. So it's not that the theory is wrong, but the fact that it's very difficult to say absolutely this is what always will happen. So why is it that people want that little compact piece of tidbit knowledge? It's because they need to rub other people's faces in it, right? So this I noticed particularly among in religion, particularly Christian circles, where they're completely okay and satisfied with a simple factoid or a simple statement that people have said, okay, this is what is absolutely true. But since everything is a religion, you see this in everything, including economic theory, and in this example, Triffin's dilemma. And the reason why people want that little factoid is because they feel superior to other people that now that they have that little factoid, right? So now they can, yell at other people. They can, shove it in other people's faces. They can have it's sort of like the trump card, right? The beat all card that you throw to end the game, right? Haha, here's my little factoid. So now you're wrong. So I think a lot of people, and I see this attitude where a lot of people want to be able to do that. Just sort of say, I know the truth, and so therefore, and you don't, so I'm better than you. That kind of childish attitude, you know. And just so you know, for my part, yeah, there are certain things that I believe are true. And if I'm going to change any of it, you're going to have to persuade me that your idea is better than mine. And that rarely happens because I self-examine myself a lot more than other people will challenge me, right? So that's what it is. People need to have this little factoid to rub other people's faces in it. For myself, I do more the Socratic approach where I'm just going to ask questions, right? So this is what you think. Oh, okay. Why do you think that? Why do you think that? So what's the implication of believing that? And so I just make the other person talk just to reveal their subjectivity. I do that primarily because, you know, anything that I say, they're just gonna, laugh out of existence unless they're directly asking me what it is that I believe. But even when I state what I believe, I'm not I'm not requiring, or do I even hope for, or do I expect other people to go along with what I say? In fact, it's usually the opposite because rarely do I have anyone agree with the things that I believe and I say. And so that's why I always take the approach, well, okay, so everyone has their own subjectivity. And if it's a hard thing for you to acknowledge that, that means you haven't really thought things through enough to realize that everyone has their opinion, which they're going to double down, triple down, quadruple down before they, even entertain someone else's understanding, subjectivity, or idea. And so for me, it's not that big of a deal because truth is infinite. And I guess now that I think about it, some people are confused when I say that, right? And it is kind of hard to conceptualize, but I like to use the analogy of three blind, I think it's an Indian Hindu story where three or four blind guys are touching an elephant, right? Different parts of the elephant, and they're describing what they think how an elephant looks, right? So one blind person is holding the elephant's leg and saying, "Oh, an elephant is like a tree." Another person is holding the elephant's trunk and saying, "Oh no, you guys don't know what you're talking about. An elephant is more like a hose, etc." And then someone's touching his body and says, "No, no, no, no. Elephant is like a wall, etc." And so you can kind of go from that. So each person is describing the elephant in part. But there's so much more to know. And you might say, well, I can draw an elephant, right? The whole perfectly the outside form and appearance of an elephant. Okay, that's great. But there's still the internal organs, the way the body functions, the DNA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's always more information. And so therefore, if you say, no, 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 this drawing is an elephant. That's all you need to know. That's the truth. Well, okay. You know what I mean? But so people just want to be able to say, I know what an elephant is, right? And so they want to lord it over other people. But that's not my game. That's not the way that I try to take in information. I acknowledge my assumption from the very beginning is that truth is infinite. And so all we can do at best is have conversations, share ideas, compare ideas, try to find better ideas, and maybe listening to what other people are saying, come to a better understanding yourself or improve the understanding that you have. Right. So because truth is infinite, the most we can hope for is the best current explanation, the best current understanding. And we have to always set aside the possibility of hearing in the future a better explanation. And if we don't do that, we will always drift into orthodoxy, right? Where some people say this is the truth. And we see glimpses of it now in Europe and in the United States where people in power say this is the truth. You must not depart from the truth. And if you post on a social media something different, well, then we're going to ban you, we're going to dox you, we're going to arrest you, we're going to fine you, right? That's the creation of the orthodoxy because you refuse to acknowledge that there is more to discuss. Therefore, in conclusion, freedom is the best. Free to trade without government mandates, right? Or even government measurements to say something is trade deficit or surplus, like it matters to you, right? You as an individual, the national surplus or deficit really is far from your mind when you place an order for a good, right? That's not what you're thinking about, right? Am I going to create a trade deficit? No, that's not what you care about. And or so you don't have to worry about government edicts or government reports, or even and especially government attempts to fix what might not even be a problem, right? So Trump and trying to address the problem of the Federal Reserve by calling it trade deficits, right? So yeah, yeah, understand what I mean. So according to Ron Paul, you don't talk about trade deficits or surpluses. What you got to do is you got to end the Fed. All right. And so all of us should be always free to believe what we want, no matter how crazy, no matter how stupid other people might think it is, as long as you're willing to pay for your beliefs, right? So if you want to believe in Jesus, sure, but it's going to cost you, right? There are going to be people who don't want to talk to you. There are other people who are going to, I don't know, not hire you or let you go from a job because of what you believe, what is relevant, uh, what's really, it's relevant, which it is relevant today, especially when it comes to the wars. I mean, if you are so crazy about this war, okay, no one's stopping you from going and fighting. All right. So why are you still here? Why are you still talking to me about, this war or that war? Just go and fight, get it over with, right? Because then if you go there and you die, well, then I don't have to listen to you anymore. But if you realize you don't want to go there and die, then you're going to stop talking about it, right? And so if you don't want to pay for certain things, right, then stop talking to me, right? And this is why government always tries to reduce freedom, right? That's not what government wants. Government doesn't want you to be free to ignore them. Government wants you to do what it says. So we must always remember that more freedom is more better. Yeah, I know that's not grammatically correct, but hey, I just wanted to keep that parallel structure, right? So freedom for the win. Believe what you want about Triffin's dilemma. Believe what you want about the Fed, whatever, but stop making me pay for your beliefs, right? Just let everyone believe and live in the way that they want. And I think the world would be a much, much better place, especially now with at least some of the things that have been invented. We can do so much more, improve the quality of life of so many more people. And it would all balance out, as long as the government did not interfere and create and magnify all of the problems that we see today. That's it for this episode. I'll talk to you next time.